Let me start by saying this clearly. My name is Walter Hayes. I'm 81 years old. I live in Baltimore, in the same neighborhood I've lived in most of my life. I worked the docks here for years, and after that I worked nights as a security guard. I'm retired now, which mostly means I finally have time to think about things I avoided when I was busy pretending I didn't. I'm talking to a camera because, at this point in life, there's no reason left to lie to myself. And once you stop doing that, you start noticing patterns you spent decades ignoring. For a long time, I believed my problems were complicated. Money, stress, relationships, fatigue, regret. It all felt tangled together, like something you'd need years of therapy or luck to sort out. What I didn't realize was that most of it came from the same few habits I kept repeating, quietly, consistently, without ever calling them what they were. Ignoring things feels harmless when you're younger. It feels practical, responsible even. You tell yourself you'll deal with it later, when you have more time, more energy, more clarity. Later doesn't arrive the way people think it does. When I look back now, I can see that about 90% of the problems that shaped my life didn't come from bad luck or bad people. They came from lessons I noticed and chose not to learn. One of the first lessons I ignored was about attention. I didn't understand how powerful attention really is, not focus. Attention, where you place it, where you withdraw it, and how often you assume it isn't needed. I gave attention to work because it rewarded me immediately. I gave attention to routine because it kept things predictable. I gave attention to problems that could be solved with effort. What I didn't give enough attention to were things that required presence instead of productivity, conversations without an agenda, emotions that didn't come with instructions, relationships that needed curiosity instead of solutions. I didn't realize that whatever you stop paying attention to doesn't freeze in place. It changes, usually quietly, usually without asking permission. Another lesson I ignored was about discomfort. Anytime something made me uncomfortable emotionally, I treated it like a nuisance, a distraction, something to push aside until things were calmer. If a conversation felt tense, I shortened it. If a thought felt unsettling, I replaced it with noise. If a feeling didn't have an obvious use, I dismissed it. I thought I was being efficient. What I was really doing was postponing problems until they became unavoidable. Discomfort isn't the enemy, it's information. And I ignored a lot of useful information because I didn't like how it felt. I also ignored how much of my stress came from trying to control outcomes instead of understanding situations. I wanted certainty, predictability, clear roles. I wanted to know where I stood and what was expected of me. Life doesn't work that way. The more I tried to lock things down, the more frustrated I became when they inevitably shifted. People changed, circumstances changed, my body changed. And every time that happened, I took it personally. I didn't see that flexibility would have solved more problems than effort ever did. Another lesson I ignored had to do with rest. I believed rest had to be earned. That exhaustion was proof of usefulness, that slowing down meant falling behind. I wore fatigue like a badge and treated it as justification for withdrawing from everything else. I didn't understand that chronic tiredness changes how you treat people. It shortens your patience. It dulls your curiosity. It makes everything feel heavier than it actually is. I created problems simply by showing up depleted and calling it normal. I also ignored how often I confused silence with peace. Just because something isn't being discussed doesn't mean it isn't affecting you. Just because no one is arguing doesn't mean everything is fine. Silence can mean comfort, but it can also mean avoidance, resignation, or distance. I assumed silence was neutral. It isn't. It always has a direction. Some of my biggest problems came from things no one ever thought about. Another lesson I ignored was about identity. I tied too much of my worth to being reliable, strong, and useful. Those are good qualities, but they're not a full identity. When that's all you allow yourself to be, anything that threatens those roles feels dangerous. I avoided admitting confusion. I avoided asking for help. I avoided redefining myself when circumstances changed. That rigidity created pressure I didn't need to carry. The last lesson I ignored for far too long was the simplest one. Problems don't usually announce themselves. They don't show up as emergencies. They show up as patterns you explain away because dealing with them feels inconvenient. You notice the same tension appearing in different places, the same arguments, the same disappointments, the same tired explanations. I noticed those patterns. I just didn't stop to ask why they kept repeating. Ignoring lessons doesn't make them disappear. It just makes them more expensive later. By the time I understood that, most of my problems were already fully formed. In the second part, I'm going to talk about which lessons mattered most, which ones I finally learned, and what changed once I stopped ignoring the same signals over and over again. When I finally stopped ignoring those patterns, I expected everything to change at once. It didn't. What changed first was how quiet things became inside my head. Not peaceful, just less crowded. Fewer arguments with myself. Fewer explanations I had to keep rehearsing. The first real shift happened when I accepted that problems don't need drama to be real. I had spent years waiting for a clear signal, something big enough to justify action. A breakdown, a confrontation, a moment where everyone agreed something had to change. Most problems never offer that courtesy. They show up as repetition, the same tension in different conversations, the same frustration in different jobs, the same disappointment wearing different faces. Once I started looking at repetition instead of events, the picture got clearer. It wasn't bad luck. It was a lesson I kept skipping. Another thing I finally understood was that understanding a lesson doesn't mean you've learned it. I could explain most of these ideas intellectually long before they changed how I lived. Knowing and doing are separated by discomfort, and that gap is where most people get stuck. I got stuck there for decades. I had to learn to sit with discomfort instead of fixing it immediately. To let an uneasy feeling finish its sentence instead of interrupting it with work, noise, or rationalization. That alone reduced more problems than any clever solution ever did. Discomfort stopped being a warning sign and became a guide. I also learned that most of my problems were self-maintained. Not self-created, but self-maintained. I kept them alive by feeding them attention, resistance, and explanations. Once I stopped doing that, many of them weakened on their own. That doesn't mean life became easy. It means it became less cluttered with unnecessary struggle. Another lesson that mattered more than I expected was learning the difference between responsibility and control. I took responsibility for everything: other people's moods, other people's outcomes, situations that were never mine to manage. I told myself that was maturity. It wasn't. It was control wearing a respectable name. When you try to manage things you don't actually control, you create constant tension. You stay alert, defensive, ready to intervene. That posture is exhausting. I lived in it for years and wondered why I was always tired. Once I let go of control and kept responsibility where it belonged, many problems simply stopped existing. They weren't solved. They were revealed as never mine to carry. I also stopped assuming that effort automatically meant progress. I worked hard for most of my life. I believed effort would eventually compensate for everything else. for miscommunication, for neglect, for lack of presence. It doesn't. Effort without attention just accelerates the wrong direction. Another lesson I ignored was how often I used busyness to avoid myself. If I stayed occupied, I didn't have to think too deeply. If I stayed tired, I didn't have to ask uncomfortable questions. I called that productivity. It was avoidance. When I finally slowed down, I didn't like what surfaced at first. Regret, anger, sadness, questions without neat answers. That's probably why I avoided slowing down in the first place. But those feelings didn't destroy me. They clarified things. Avoiding them had been costing me more. One of the most practical changes came when I stopped assuming problems had to be solved immediately. Urgency was one of my biggest sources of stress. Everything felt important. Everything felt time-sensitive. Most of it wasn't. When you treat everything like an emergency, you burn out your judgment. You make reactive decisions and call them necessary. Slowing the pace of response solved problems I didn't even know I was creating. I also learned how many issues came from unspoken expectations. I expected people to understand me without explanation. I expected situations to unfold logically. I expected effort to be noticed. When those expectations weren't met, I felt wronged. I didn't realize how much pain came from expectations I never stated and never questioned. Once I started naming expectations, many problems either resolved or revealed themselves clearly. Either way, they stopped lingering. Another lesson I ignored was about endings. I held on to things long after they had stopped working because I didn't like closure. Endings felt like failure, like wasted effort, like admitting I misjudged something. What I learned too late is that refusing to end things creates more damage than ending them ever would. Jobs, roles, habits, versions of myself. Letting them expire would have saved me years of friction. Problems grow in spaces you refuse to close. I also underestimated how much kindness mattered in daily life. Not grand gestures, small kindness, tone, patience, willingness to pause. I thought those things were optional once a relationship was established. They aren't. Many of my problems came from assuming goodwill would last without maintenance. It doesn't. It needs reinforcement, even when nothing seems wrong. The last lesson I want to mention is the simplest one, and the one I resisted the most. Most of your problems don't require fixing. They require noticing. Noticing where you're repeating yourself, noticing what you're avoiding, noticing where your energy keeps draining, noticing what keeps coming back despite your best efforts to ignore it. When you notice honestly, action becomes obvious. Not easy, obvious. 90% of my problems came from ignoring these lessons. Not because I was careless, but because I was busy, tired, and convinced I'd deal with things later. Later didn't come with instructions. It came with consequences. I don't share this because I figured everything out. I didn't. I share it because most problems lose their power once you stop pretending they're mysterious. They're not. They're repetitive, predictable, patient. If you catch them early, they whisper. If you ignore them, they shout. Either way, they're trying to teach you something. I ignored them for a long time, and I paid for that in ways I can't reverse. But understanding them now still matters. It keeps me from creating new problems out of old habits. It keeps the days simpler, quieter, more honest. That's enough for me.